As far as disturbing games go, I think there's fewer things more disturbing than games based off of actual tragedies, which is what I hope to discuss in this video. Although, I must be very direct, with a little bit of a content warning. This video follows YouTube's guidelines and was created for educational and documentary purposes. This channel does not hope to promote or condone any acts of violence or extremism. All the content here is presented critically, and conspiracy theories are addressed and debunked. This video examines a couple of disturbing chapters in internet history, in which real-world tragedy was transformed into interactive media. We'll explore how these projects came to be, the controversies surrounding them, and the ethical lines they force people to confront.
BBD and ecstasy, conceited with no self-esteem. She's a teenage dream if you
Although I probably wouldn't have the balls to do the same thing in America.
hate yourself.
Super Columbine RPG. As far as games based off of actual tragedies go, I feel like it's only appropriate to start with the game that started it all, Super Columbine RPG, a 2D RPG built directly on the bones of the 1999 Columbine school shooting. Created by Danny Ledon and released in 2005, while it can be argued that it might have just been edgy for edgy's sake, there are a couple question marks on this game. At the time, there simply just hadn't been a game like this, a game directly based on an actual mass shooting or massacre. And although when it comes to disturbing games, you could point to things like Ethnic Cleansing or even Harvester, games that involved offensive and straight up disturbing elements and themes, none of those were actually based on actual reality, in the sense that none of those games actually claimed to be based off of actual events that had happened. And when getting directly into this game, the first thing you hear up when the game's booted is a weird low-quality version of Marilyn Manson's The Nobodies, a song that was actually dedicated to the Columbine shooters. It's at this point when you get into the actual game. The game opens up in the bedroom of Eric Harris, where you're given the option to just walk around and explore. Poking around, you can see things on the wall like his Doom poster, and some antidepressants lying around. For a while, I genuinely just thought that this was like some sort of drug, but it turns out no. I'm not exactly sure what the messaging behind this is supposed to be, but maybe there's not supposed to be any. Of course, this is before you meet up with Dylan, and it's at this point when you realize just how weird the dialogue is, as a lot of it is just dialogue that was lifted directly from the killer's journals, recordings, and other conversations that they had. It just kind of flows weird if I'm being honest. Not to mention the KMFD poster. Yeah, they become very relevant for some reason. It's at this point when you get to the basement and you discover a Marilyn Manson CD, which functions as a stat booster. This and the Doom game as well, which is kind of weird, but also kind of makes sense if you understand what the creator was going for, which is so dumb. It's here where you can also trigger a couple different cutscenes, including a cutscene where they apparently watch Apocalypse Now, and another one which functions as a flashback where the two of them discuss buying guns. One of the flashbacks even shows them making one of their old basement tapes, which was very much a real thing. It's at this point where the game shows you its first real pictures that have just been pixelized. At this point, you get to the part where they start to drive to the school, and we get treated to one of my least favorite parts about this game, the constant use of quoting things. And I use quote very loosely, as the entire thing is basically just dumped here. This time specifically, the lyrics of a KMFDM song, like the entire song. And if you don't know who KMFDM is, well, they're a German industrial band who has had their music referenced by multiple shooters and had their merch worn by, let's just say, more than a couple of people with very bad intentions. Pretty recently, that one self-hating black guy who claimed to be a groiper, and that one female school shooter. Hell, even that one guy who shot up a supermarket for a Danny Phantom character happened to be wearing the exact same shirt. Basically, everybody who wears the KMFDM shirt before committing a tragedy is in some way, shape, or form referencing the Columbine tragedy. Once you finally get to the school, you're greeted to some of the worst level design that I've ever seen in my entire life. Is instead of creating a dedicated sprite for a car and just copy pasting it a couple times, or even just finding one off the internet, instead Danny Ledon just straight up low-res images from Google and copy-pastes those into the game. And it looks god-awful and just fucks with the perspective of everything. I'm not gonna say it's the worst thing in the world, even though I probably already did, but it's not exactly pretty to look at. But after this point in the game, you get something that actually feels like an actual game with actual level design, although with a pretty morbid concept. As at this point in the game, you're planting explosives in the school, but you're also tasked with basically just hiding in plain sight, avoiding cameras but also avoiding NPCs. The only way to get through a camera is to go right under it. Being seen by one basically means you automatically lose. And likewise, getting touched by an NPC also means basically the exact same thing. Essentially, it's an antisocial simulator at this point. Once you rearm, your one very specific goal is basically to get to the cafeteria and specifically to one window. And here is where the really controversial part starts, as now you're allowed to eliminate quite literally whoever you want. Anybody, basically. As many people as you possibly can. And one of the most bizarre parts about this is how everybody is basically stripped of their names and individuality during this part of the game. Everybody is whittled down to nothing more than high school stereotypes / caricatures. For example, the jock, the janitor, nerd girl, and likewise. It's quite dehumanizing if you really think about it. You basically go on this insane massacre, recreating the actual events of the shooting before you end up in the north part of the library and get involved in a shootout with the police. At some point, the characters realize that there's really nothing more they can do and end up turning the guns on themselves, mimicking the events of the real-life tragedy. And at this point in the game, you would think the game would be over, right? It would only make sense. I mean, you basically already recreated the actual tragedy, so what else could you possibly fit into a game like this to begin with? But here's the thing, Danny somehow found a way to do that, as you get something that almost resembles a dream sequence. It's very bizarre and strange and features the two characters who are seemingly dead at this point, on an island and shirtless for some reason, just chilling. And although you could argue there's some messaging behind this, it just feels weird and kind of out of place in a game like this. It's at this point in the game where you get something that almost seems to be a tribute to the two killers, which is extremely sad for some reason, despite the fact that they're the ones who did the damn shooting, but you know, that's besides the point. And you would think the game would be over at this point. But no, because here's the thing. The game somehow manages to keep going after this, and it goes places you simply just wouldn't expect a game like this to go. Or maybe you would if you're genuinely mentally frizzled up, I don't know. As from this point on, the game no longer takes place in the real world, but instead hell. Yes, the actual biblical, actually I struggle to say biblical because I don't know what Bible verse describes hell like this. So at this point in the game, any pretense of social awareness or socially aware gaming is basically just gone, and you're left playing as Dylan. Instead of fighting actual original characters either, you end up fighting Doom characters for some reason, and going on this weird ass adventure. Now, what makes it so strange is that this is basically half the game. Yeah, only about half this game that is supposedly based on actual school shooters is about those school shooters actually doing what they did. The rest of this game is basically a game that has nothing to do with that at all. It's just a weird, edgy sort of mess of a product, I would say. Can I even call it a product? I mean, it was free to play, so I think that at this point in the game, it becomes really clear why I don't respect Danny Ladon or his creative process. It's very clear that he showed some level of restraint, even if it was only minimal in the first half of the game. But at this point in the game, the facade is completely gone. What's worse is that the game isn't even like a completely incompetent game either. Like, I feel like people still would have played this if he just made his weird game about characters who end up in hell and fight doom sprites. But no, the guy had to base it off of actual school shooters. And I mean, at this point in the game, it becomes so weird, goofy, and bizarre, I don't even know what to make of it, or how to describe it. And if these weird character cameos weren't weird enough, this game goes even stranger by introducing the devil. Yes, Satan. But it's not just any devil, no, it's the one from South Park. Because, of course it is. Now, of course, I could argue that maybe there's a deeper reason why that has to do with the creators of South Park and their involvement in a documentary about gun violence and the massacre itself, but that's besides the point. I honestly think that has nothing to do with it. And from this point on, the entire point of the game is basically just to take over hell and defeat the devil. Yeah, I'm not even making this up. Basically, the whole game from this point on is about usurping power from the devil. This is just meaningless and edgy for no reason. When it's all basically done and over with, you get the actual last sequence of the game, where it shows the families of the victims seeming to have a press conference after the tragedy. And let me just tell you something. If I was a victim of any of this stuff, or lost somebody because of this, and found out this Danny Ladon guy put me in a game, let's just say I'd spin the block on his ass, consensually, in Minecraft. Yeah, I already know this video is gonna get banned. If I had to describe this game in just a couple of words, I would call it needlessly edgy and insensitive. And if I had to describe it in just one word, or compound word, I would just say tryhard. Because that's what this game is. It doesn't have a message, even if Danny pretends like it does. It doesn't even really have much of a purpose. It doesn't say anything. And it's not this amazingly built game either. Not saying that that would even save it considering the subject matter, but that's besides the point. It's kind of clear and obvious what kind of guy made this game and around what time. It really does feel like a product of the early internet in a lot of ways. But there's honestly nothing good I can really say about this game, even if the game isn't terribly built or anything. It's perfectly playable, but do you really want to play it? That's kind of the main issue. One of the most concerning things that this game did is sort of start a trend of people making these sort of games going forward, which is something that I just can't respect. In many ways, Danny was a pioneer of his time, deciding to base a game off of an actual real tragedy and capitalizing off of actual pain, or just being edgy if that's the way you view it. But again, I just don't believe this guy deserves to be respected for creating this abomination. But he's far from the only person who did something like this, even if he was more or less the first. VTech Rampage. So after talking about Super Columbine RPG, I think it's only appropriate to talk about a game that was heavily inspired by it. VTech Rampage was a game released in 2007, based on the tragic Virginia Tech shooting that had happened earlier that same year. The game depicts a loose recreation of the events that took place during that attack. The game was created by an amateur Australian developer, Ryan Lambourne, also known by his at the time alias, Pigpen. He was a 21-year-old Australian user who, like many others back around that same time period, uploaded various animations and small projects to the site, garnering very little attention at first. Honestly, his early Newgrounds history isn't particularly all that interesting, as it's pretty consistent with what you would find on the site around that same time. But all that was going to change. April 16, 2007, Sun Wee Cho, a student at Virginia Tech, carried out a mass shooting. Cho would go on to kill 32 people, including students, faculty, and staff. He would begin his attack by murdering 2 of his initial victims early in the morning, before then proceeding to mail a package of confessions and video documentation to NBC News, rearming himself before then making his way across the campus, trying to eliminate as many people as he possibly could, before eventually turning the gun on himself. Of course, with just how much coverage this story was getting, you can somewhat understand why an opportunistic developer might want to capitalize. In under a month, Ryan Lambourne would go on to base an entire game off of the events that transpired. As for the game itself, as I said earlier, the game is essentially a loose recreation of the real-life events, but this time with the player being put directly in the role of Cho. The game is divided into 3 main stages. The first stage walks the player through the initial murder of the 2 college students, this time with the added option that you can kill anybody and you're not limited to just those 2. The second stage primarily revolves around the player being in charge of mailing Cho's package of confessions to NBC News, while also avoiding the police. The final stage has the player locking down the campus and basically, getting rid of everybody. If the player fails, they're thrown in jail, but if they succeed, they're given this equally disturbing cutscene where Cho shoots himself. This ending also features an original song by Pigpen.
Hey, fuck the RIAA. Hey, fuck the RIAA. Hey, fuck the RIAA. Hey, fuck the RIAA.
This is certainly, something. I'll give him that. I think after talking about this game, it becomes pretty obvious that this was nothing more than a crude attempt by its creator to garner some sort of attention. Whether that attention was good or bad was kind of irrelevant. This isn't even much of a secret either, especially considering the fact that Lambert himself has essentially admitted to this.
If I was in America right now and I did the same thing, although I probably wouldn't have the balls to do the same thing in America.
I think that ignoring a person like this probably has the best effect. If he's genuine about the way he feels about this stuff, I think he's a threat to the broader community.
The more you look into the game, the more and more obvious it becomes that certain things were just done for shock value and very little else. Simply put, he just wanted to garner attention. Whether that attention was good or bad was pretty irrelevant to him. Like a sad little attention goblin. Calling him a troll almost feels too generous. It's more sad than anything. I think a good example of this is that at some point, he pledged that he would remove the game from Newgrounds if he was able to receive $1,000 worth of donations. Remove the game from his personal site if he was able to get $2,000 worth of donations. And even go as far as to make a public apology if he was able to reach a goal of $3,000. Surprisingly, he didn't think people would actually donate to his cause, but strangely enough, people very much did, leading Ryan to later shut down the entire thing. I think all these years later, it's very clear that he was trying to hide what he was doing under the guise of irony. Maybe he was ahead of his time in that sense, but it doesn't really come off all that well when you're essentially just admitting that you're doing it all for attention. It's very important to mention this game's relation to Super Columbine RPG, in the sense that Ryan Lambourne was very much inspired by Danny Ladon. Super Columbine had only come out 2 years prior, and had garnered quite a bit of attention itself. And although Danny Ladon did claim that his game was socially aware, and that his game was more intelligent than people would think it was, Ryan clearly just didn't care. Maybe he was just more mask off, or he was just too stupid to understand, but I do find the whole thing just genuinely kind of shocking. The reaction to this game was basically what you would think it would be. But the thing about this game is because it was a Newgrounds game, the site did receive a fair amount of pushback for allowing such a thing to stay up on their site. Traditionally, Newgrounds had a very anti-censorship stance. As long as something wasn't illegal or violating their very, very, very loose terms of service, it was usually allowed. The game was removed briefly from Newgrounds, but only because it contained a copywritten song, that song being Shine by Collective Soul, one of Cho's favorite tracks apparently. But once that copywritten song was removed, the game was allowed to be posted back up. And so now, almost 20 whole years later, the game is still allowed up on the site, and still very much playable. But funny enough, this wouldn't be Ryan's only attempt to create a game in this fashion.
The Slaying of Sandy Hook.
December 14th of 2012, in the city of Newtown, Connecticut, a severely mentally unhinged gunman by the name of Adam Lanza would make his way to a local elementary school, murdering 26 people, 20 of his victims being children. This tragic event would later go on to be known as the Sandy Hook shooting. Despite there technically being fewer victims this time around than in the Virginia Tech shooting, the extremely young ages of the victims made the event far more tragic and impactful for many people involved. Unfortunately though, there were many conspiracies surrounding the Sandy Hook shooting, one of the most infamous being that the entire thing was somehow a hoax, and that everybody involved were paid actors. And yeah, people genuinely believe this.
Infowars.com.
This is the man who wants to deport me from the country for wanting to get rid of
No, it's
assault
to
rifles,
point out you're a foreigner, a
mass
red coat,
outrages.
here telling us what to do.
Whatever.
You know, sometimes you just want to lose faith in humanity, you know what I'm saying? But as far as less crazy rumors go, there were other rumors that Lanza was in some way inspired by violent video games. Specifically speaking, people were pointing the finger to this one Flash game known as Kindergarten Killer. The only issue here is that there's absolutely no evidence that Lanza was even aware of this game's existence, much less that he played it, or that it played any part in him eventually going on to do what he did. Unfortunately though, that didn't really matter all that much. At this point, several years had passed, and Ryan makes his way back into the story. See, at this point, Ryan, for whatever reason, decided that he would, for whatever reason, throw his hat back in the ring. Maybe just for one last time. And so, just a year later, he would create a brand new game known as The Slaying of Sandy Hook Elementary. although this game was somewhat different from his previous game, VTech Rampage, which was much more of a crude attempt to get a rise out of people. The slaying of Sandy Hook Elementary would be very different, or at least as different as a game like this could be. While VTech Rampage was almost a parody of the real-life events, acting as a kind of abridged version where nothing was really handled with any sort of seriousness, and the player was never made to feel the weight of their actions, sprinkled with jokes and memes. The slaying of Sandy Hook, though, would trade that tone for something much darker. This time around, you may have noticed that the game is far more stylized, with the characters being depicted as dark silhouettes and the backgrounds as primary colors. This game also features significantly more blood than his previous attempt. This game is also different from VTech Rampage in the sense that it doesn't include much music, being far more selective with where it chooses to use its soundtrack. But see, that didn't mean the game was spared from criticism in any way, even if this time around, Ryan's goal wasn't to offend anybody, as Ryan would clarify his intentions multiple times, including in the game itself.
Hi, I'm Ryan Jake Lamborn, creator of this game. Back in 2007, I created a game called VTech Rampage about the Virginia Tech shootings. In the years since, I've been routinely asked by fans of VTech to make more games of just about every mass shooting that's gotten media coverage. I'm someone who rarely follows the news, so these updates have been a constant reminder of just how commonplace mass shootings and school shootings have become. I grew up in Houston, Texas, where I remember guns and ammunition being available, in unmanned sections of Walmart, and, just it being commonplace to hear gunshots in the distance as I tried to go to sleep, which is a stark contrast to Sydney, Australia, where I moved to in 2001. Australia had sweeping gun control put in place after the 1996 Port Arthur massacre, in which 35 people died. And the result of that sweeping regulation is guns are no longer a noticeable part of Australian culture. Gun violence is practically non-existent here, and it's just something you don't see around anymore.
According to Ryan, the game was in no way, shape, or form attempted to promote violence, but instead, to raise awareness. Now, I don't want to play armchair psychologist here, but what I can say is that it feels like Ryan was trying to redeem himself in his own way. By this point in time, a couple of years had passed, and you have to imagine Ryan would have gotten older, at least by a bit, which could have made him realize how offensive his original game was. Although it also might have something to do with his partial hero, Danny Ladon, kinda disowning him. But realistically, if I had to simplify my only guess, I would say that Ryan had simply snapped out of it at this point, and was attempted to be slightly less edgy. But considering his past history, it was almost impossible for anybody to look past that. And it's very important to realize this game was far more controversial and got far more media coverage than anything he had previously created before, including VTech Rampage. Whilst yeah, he may have gotten one Australian news spot and a couple of articles written about him for that, Sandy Hook was far more controversial in a way, almost seeming to get 24-hour news coverage.
Certainly the culture of violence, and look at the level of violence in our media, video games, the depiction of these assault weapons again and again. There might well be some direct connection between people who have a mental instability, and they when they go over the edge, they transpose themselves. They become part of one of those video games.
Tom Flubb, co-creator of Newgrounds, would be contacted multiple times about the game's existence, where in his defense, he would make it clear that Newgrounds was simply just a host site, and therefore not necessarily involved in the creation of any of the games hosted on their site. And although Tom did try to keep the game up for as long as he could, there was a breaking point. The outrage from news outlets and the media at large sort of culminated in the game basically having to be removed. After the game's removal, Tom would issue a statement. Over the years, a number of highly offensive games and movies have been published to Newgrounds, and despite the hate mail and being dropped by every ad company in existence, we held firm on a policy of anti-censorship. Today, however, I pulled a reversal on that policy. And maybe it was a huge mistake, or maybe it was the right thing to do. I'm not sure. There'll be a variety of opinions on the matter. It's not like we don't already slip on our censorship policy. We've removed racist and homophobic stuff, more so than YouTube, I would say. And we removed shovelware games built off of common templates with zero passion. This game, however, had a certain level of artfulness and craftsmanship to it. There was a visual technique and quality that revealed a serious level of effort and passion. It also had a political message I personally agree with, a statement on gun control and the problem of gun violence in the US. It attempted to demonstrate how things can play out differently with changes in our gun laws. It made you feel and it made you think. It did so, however, in the context of the Sandy Hook massacre, recreating the event and putting you in the role of the shooter. Newgrounds has faced harsh criticism in the past for standing firm on not censoring distasteful material, namely games about school shootings. All I can say is that this game took things to a new level in terms of the ages of the victims and the realism of the terror they faced that day. I was personally contacted by Sandy Hook parents. They expressed their understanding of what the game was attempting to communicate, but also expressed the sadness and horror it made them feel, and their desire to have it removed. Today, I'm choosing respect for the Sandy Hook parents over respect for the NG censorship policies. Either decision in the matter puts a knot in my stomach. I'm of course interested on hearing thoughts on the matter, especially from artists on the site. The game would later be posted to a different site entirely. And although the game was not removed, Ryan didn't seem to be all that bothered, instead proceeding to move in a completely different direction. Ryan would later release a game in 2015, known as Social Interaction Trainer, a game that was a very obvious far cry from what he was previously known for, and a game that also managed to get him some level of notoriety, with the game going on to be played by big YouTubers, and enjoyed by many. At this point, it might have seemed like Ryan's story was over, and for all intents and purposes it was, at least in relation to the development of video games based off of actual tragedies, as Ryan seemed to more or less mellow out, and for what it's worth, nobody else really came along to develop games like this, although there are more obscure examples, one notable one being Elliot Rodgers' The Video Game. Although this one had such little information known about it, it didn't even feel appropriate to put it on this list, with the most interesting thing about that game being the fact that it was lost for so many years. Overall, there really aren't that many more games that I could find, and so maybe for what it's worth, that means this bizarre chapter in internet history is more or less over, although I can't necessarily guarantee that that's the case. Anyways, I don't have anything else to say. I hope you learned something, and as always, take caution.